well, thanks for coming. I'm Andrew Mefferd. I am the editor of Growing for Market magazine, and I passed around some cards. I'd also like to pass around, I brought some extra magazines. Feel free to help yourself. Have one, have two if you have things, that you have a friend who might be interested. If you're not familiar with the magazine, it comes out 10 times a year, and we try to be have news and information for local growers.
Good with the lights like that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So this talk is fruiting crops in protected culture. This is sort of like an intro level course. Later on today at 2:15, I believe it is, I'm giving the advanced version of this talk. So in fact, some of the things that we're going to touch on in this talk now we'll elaborate more on later. So if this gets your attention, you could, and you want to know more, you could come to the later presentation. So let me tell you a bit about me, because I think that if you understand the perspective that I have on writing this book in particular and the information I'm going to present today, it'll make more sense to you. I did not grow up on a farm. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I had a farm one generation back in the family in Pennsylvania, which is actually where we first started our farm, and that's one of my entry points into farming. It got me interested. So the way that I learned farming was by apprenticing. Moved around the country, worked on farms in 6 states. Started out working in Pennsylvania, and then worked out in California for a while, Washington State. Came back east and worked in the research farm for Virginia Tech for a while. Then we started our farm, which was certified organic by NOFA at the time. Originally started it in Pennsylvania. Had to move due to loss of use of the land. And then we apprenticed for 2 more years while we tried to figure out what our next move was. So we apprenticed in upstate New York and then out to the coast of Maine, which is, while we were apprenticing on the coast of Maine, that's where we saw the farm where we've lived for the last 8 or 9 years. Is that loud enough? Can everybody hear me up in the back? All right, great. In fact, going from originally starting our farm in Pennsylvania and then having to move it, we literally rented a flatbed trailer, put all of our equipment on an 18-wheeler and trucked it up to Maine. So we kept the same name, kept all of our equipment, and almost as soon as we moved to Maine, I started working for Johnny's Selected Seeds. It was serendipitous because we didn't know this, but the farm that we relocated to was about half an hour away from the Johnny's research farm. So for the last 7 years, I worked as the greenhouse specialist, the protected culture specialist there at Johnny's. In fact, my last day there was Friday the 13th of November of 2015. I left that because I knew that I was going to take over Growing for Market magazine, which if you're not familiar, last year was the 25th year of the magazine. In fact, the same woman, Lynn Basinski, she started it and had run it the whole time. And how that whole thing came about is that I had been writing for the magazine for the last 5 years or so. And she, after doing it for 25 years, she was just ready to hand it off to someone else. And she told me that she thought it was important in a small publication like we have for the editor of the magazine to also write for it. So she approached me and said, "You're already writing for the magazine, how about you take it over?" And I thought that was a good way for me to be able to come home and work from the farm, because now I run the magazine from our farm there in central Maine. And so I've been doing that for just about a year. We took the magazine over last January, so I've been running the magazine for just over a year, and just finished working on a new book called The Greenhouse and Hoophouse Grower's Handbook, Organic Vegetable Production Using Protected Culture. And very excited. I just got the first copies about a week and a half ago. I do have a copy of the book here from Chelsea Green Publishing here in Vermont. I do have a copy of the book if you'd like to look at it, and I'm sure, Michael, there's somebody selling the book here, right?
Yeah. Over in the exhibitors.
Yeah, if you'd like to get a copy, they are selling it here. So that's really my perspective. That's where I'm coming from, okay? And so what I noticed after working on and visiting many small and large farms is that most of the smaller growers are basically using field growing techniques in their structures, whether it be a greenhouse or a hoop house. and they were not realizing the full potential of their hoop houses and greenhouses. In fact, Michael may remember one of the original titles that we talked about for this book was getting the most out of your greenhouse or hoop house, because that's what I saw. You know, people had already put the investment of money, the sweat equity of putting these structures up, and they weren't really maximizing them. They weren't getting everything out of their greenhouses and hoop houses that they possibly could. So here's the cover of the book again. There's a specific reason that I wanted to show you the book. This was my favorite cover. The publisher mocked up a few different covers, and I like this one. The reason I like this one in particular, in fact, some people are like, you know, I don't like this cover. You got that big greenhouse up there at the top. In fact, all the rest of these pictures are my pictures. The one at the top is just of a big greenhouse somewhere that someone took. And to me, what this cover means is that when I was working at Johnny's, I got access to a lot of research greenhouses, a lot of much larger commercial type greenhouses. And what I noticed is they just had a totally different way of growing than the way that I had been exposed to apprenticing around and growing on my own farm. Because I'd say that on my own farm, we used our growing methods were just a mashup of all the methods that we saw. You know, we worked on so many different farms. I think that was a real asset to us because we just picked and chose the techniques that we liked the best that we saw on the farms that we worked on. So to me, this is kind of what the book does, is I'm bringing the techniques from the larger commercial growers and trying to explain them to smaller growers. And the other thing I should say about this is that this book would never have happened if I hadn't also been farming at the same time, because the whole time I was working at Johnny's, we were running our farm, and honestly, you know, my wife was basically our farm manager because the whole time we've been there almost, I was working full-time off the farm. So really, I was our greenhouse manager. My wife was really our farm manager. And so the difference between field and protected growing was only apparent to me after I was exposed to it's really a Dutch method of growing. And I think it's really important because extending the season on direct market farms is basically extending local food season. You know, we've seen a growth in demand for local food, and really now the challenge is to meet that demand. And one of the ways is to just make local food season longer. So I was going to these bigger greenhouses and seeing these, what I call the Dutch techniques, which I'll cover in just a second. And I saw these growers were getting much higher yields than I was on my own farm. And I thought, I wonder if these techniques apply to my own little hoop houses, because production on my farm, we mostly have unheated hoop houses. We have a little bit of heated space that we mostly use for propagation. So my question was, will the techniques from big greenhouses like that translate to smaller farms with much lower tech growing structures and potentially no heat at all? And so if I hadn't been running a farm at the same time, it might have just been a question. So what I did is I tried out the techniques that I learned in the bigger greenhouses, and for the most part, they translate really well, even to unheated, very simple structures. And so that's what the book is about. It's basically the techniques that the biggest growers are using that work for smaller growers. So. There's this analogy that I use in the book that I'd like to use here really quickly. Okay, so in the book I cite the most recent complete figures for agricultural exports. So in the book we say 2015. I'm not sure if 2016 numbers are out yet. Doesn't matter. Most years lately, this is a fairly consistent pattern. The United States is the #1 agricultural exporter in the world. The Dutch are #2. A lot of years, this is how it shakes out. What's wrong with this picture? Does anybody know? Why is this misleading?
Holland is tiny and that's a little bigger.
Beautiful. All right, Holland is about 2/3 the size of West Virginia. How is a country 2/3 the size of West Virginia coming in second to the United States? So, lots of greenhouses. The Dutch are just extremely productive, for one thing, by using greenhouses. For another thing, by making the most of everything they have. Essentially, efficient use of space, water, fertilizer, power, labor, everything. And so they're grown in greenhouses. And the other thing is that they're concentrating on high-value crops. Fruiting vegetables, leafy vegetables, flowers, okay? So they're being very productive of high-value crops. And this is what I want the smaller farms to take away from this presentation, is to do similar kinds of things. So it's my goal. I'm hoping that of the techniques that I can show you today, that every one of you leaves with at least one idea. You're probably in farm planning mode right now, right? So I'm hoping that you can leave today and all of you have at least one thing where you're like, maybe I'd like to try that on my farm this season. Even just the choice of crops. In fact, in my book, the subtitle is Best Practices for the eight most profitable crops. And so just the fact that I hone in on 8 crops, and it's really just 2 crop groups. It's the vining, fruiting crops that we're going to talk about today, the tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and eggplant, and the leafy crops, which are lettuce, greens, microgreens, and herbs. We're mostly talking about basil in greenhouse, but for mixed growers, could be other herbs too. The reason I'm not talking about just growing anything in a greenhouse, that is meant, just the selection of crops that we talk about in the book is meant to be a suggestion to smaller growers that if you want to stay in business, these are the really tried and true crops. And I spend a little bit of time at the end of the book talking about maybe you have a really great market for some other crop and you want to try to extend the season on that. I talk a little bit about trying to evaluate whether other crops are going to essentially pay the bills of your greenhouse or not. But it's really those 8 crops. And this is something that I just noticed from going in greenhouse after greenhouse after greenhouse, that most of them those are the 8 crops that they're growing, because greenhouse growing is expensive. You got more investments than in the field, and those are just the most reliable producers. And I'll talk a little bit more about crop selection in a minute. So I want to give you the big picture here. This is the slide where I tell you what I'm going to tell you before I tell you. The Dutch growing system is based on dense spacing, particularly with the vining fruiting crops here, pruning and trellising to facilitate airflow, using greenhouse varieties, optimizing fertility, optimizing the climate, which means both temperature and humidity. That's what I mean by climate. It's not just one or the other. The whole big picture of the crop environment. Grafting where appropriate. Augmenting carbon dioxide, and advanced use of climate to keep the plants active and for vegetative and generative steering. Now, this doesn't mean, it's not like you have to do all of these. I'm just saying this is pretty standard. If you go to a big greenhouse, like this one, for example, this is an example of what it looks like in the greenhouse of a large tomato greenhouse. Spacing is very tight, plants are very tall, plants are all in double rows. The things that I describe here on this slide are a fairly common thing. Almost all the commercial greenhouses that you go into are doing all these things. As a grower, it's not a system where you have to do every single one of these. You could do some of these and not others, and if you're not doing them already, they would still help your production. Okay, so which crops to grow? So I focused on the 8 crops because they just consistently are worth the extra expense of protected growing. So I already talked about the 4 vining fruiting crops and the 4 leafy crops. And so why are these crops so consistently returning in greenhouses? For one thing, they can't be stored. So there needs to be consistent fresh supply, right? Unlike potatoes or carrots or something like that, you need a constant fresh supply of salad greens and tomatoes and stuff like that. There's year-round demand, so it'll pay for heating. And I'm not saying in fact, I'm definitely not an advocate of heating all through the winter. I think I definitely know people who have tried and are heating straight through the winter, and I think that's usually not profitable. But there is year-round demand for these things. So pretty much however much you wanted to push your season, you'd probably have a market for these crops. And the last part of why these crops are valuable is because they are high enough value to pay back the investment in labor, structure, and heat. You know, you're going to be getting a high enough price per pound or per bag, or however you're selling these things, to pay for your investment in the protected culture. All right, so in my opinion, the kind of like the bedrock of this whole system is dense, is just dense spacing. It's, you know, it goes to figure. If you can cram more plants into a structure, you're going to get a higher yield, as long as you can keep the plants healthy. So one of the reasons that you can pack more plants into a greenhouse or a hoop house than the field is because the leaves stay dry. And to my mind, one of the biggest advantages of growing in a greenhouse or a hoop house is keeping the leaves dry, because regardless of what crop you're growing, foliar diseases are more likely when you have wet leaves. Okay, so for one thing, it keeps the leaves dry, so you're able to cram more plants in. Pruning and trellising helps, because you're growing the plants up and keeping them off each other, and you're with these vining fruiting crops, in a lot of cases, you're taking off the bottom leaves to facilitate airflow down at the base of the plant, where otherwise moisture and humidity build up, and that's a lot of times where disease starts. If you've grown tomatoes or these other vining fruiting crops, it tends to happen where the disease starts at the bottom and works its way up. Airflow is a big deal for all the crops. I don't know if you can see it because it kind of blends in, but up in the corner there, you can see, this is one of my hoop houses. In fact, that's my son when he was considerably younger than he is now. Doing things besides pruning to facilitate airflow, as far as having fans and stuff like that, and having good ventilation in your house helps a lot. And greenhouse varieties can help with all crops, just because greenhouse varieties are frequently bred to resist different diseases, the diseases that you commonly see in greenhouses and hoop houses. Okay, so to give you an example of how this worked out on my own farm, these are two of my hoop houses here. In fact, the beginning slide are these same hoop houses. In the first one, they were covered with snow, much like they look right now after getting 3 feet of snow on Monday and Tuesday in central Maine. So one of the best examples that I can tell you of how this helped us is that typically what we do is these two hoop houses, we would plant one to tomatoes. You can see that one in the foreground is all full of tomatoes. So we would plant one house to tomatoes and one house to cucumbers and just switch them back and forth. And that was our lame crop rotation, which is better than nothing, but it's not great, but it's better than no crop rotation. So when we started out, we would get about a ton of tomatoes out of actually this planting. And this is kind of a neat picture, because this is from the year that we built these hoop houses. And so what happened is, of course, we were running late, and we had all these tomato transplants ready to go and getting overgrown. And so what we did is we put the cover on the hoop house, planted the tomatoes, because we had other stuff to do on the farm. We weren't really sure when we'd get to putting the end walls on. And then we put the end walls on later. Not really ideal, but it's how we did it. And but I'm glad we did, because it gave me this opportunity to take this picture, which couldn't be better for showing the arrangements of plants in the hoop house. Okay, so when we started out, we did 5 single rows of tomatoes. Okay. And by the time we finished up, this is how we grow tomatoes now. This looks funny because I took this picture through insect netting, which was on the end wall vents of this house to keep insects out. But it's just like the picture with my son in it earlier. We went from 5 single rows to 5 double rows. So that would be something right there. If you I have pretty detailed spacing recommendations in this book. I personally felt a little bit of trepidation when I went from this, going from this to this. In fact, I thought, because I thought, what if it's just the heating and humidity control in those bigger greenhouses that's keeping them from getting the diseases at this higher spacing? It's a risk that I took with my own production. I just had to kind of say, I'm going to try it. Although I did baby steps a little bit. What I did is the first year, I went from 5 single rows to 4 double rows. Okay, so I didn't double the density the first year, and that worked so well that I went to. Actually, I went to 4 double rows, and then I went to 4 double rows and 1 single row out on each edge. And I realized 4 double rows and 1 single row on each edge is the same as 5 double rows. And so now I just plant 5 double rows. It's a lot easier to manage than having a single row out on the edge. So I've doubled the number of plants that I get into a house, and along with these other things, we did double our production. We went from getting about 1 ton of tomatoes out of one of these 30 by 48 hoop houses to 2 tons of tomatoes. And I mean, it's not all about yield. In fact, if all I wanted was a yield, I would grow all greenhouse varieties. Typically what I do in these houses is I'll grow about half real greenhouse beefsteaks and half heirloom varieties. And I get about, I have to say that I get about half to 2/3 of the yield out of the heirlooms as I do out of the greenhouse varieties. So if it were all about yield for me, I would just grow all greenhouse types. I personally, the heirlooms are one of my favorite things to grow. Plus we have customers that I think would not come see us if we did not have the heirlooms. On the other hand, we have some customers who really like our greenhouse beefsteaks, and so that's one way that I could get our yield even higher. And getting 2 tons out of a 30 by 48 hoop house isn't certainly no. I'm not saying that's the maximum. There's still room to improve there, but I'm just saying that we've improved our production a lot over time. And there's other things we could do, like growing all greenhouse varieties, if we just needed a lot of yield. But we do things like that, even though we know we're going to get less yield because we like growing those things. And of course, and these are unheated houses. Our yields could be much higher if we heated and simply extended the season. So there's a lot of progress that you can make on just on yield. And this is not just applicable to the tall trellised crops. I want to show you this. This is from a hoop house out in California. Very simple structure. This is like a hay grove structure you may be familiar with, or just a field tunnel. It's a very simple structure. And so they're not going to trellis these, but same principle. Instead of growing a single row of eggplant down each bed, they double them up. And so obviously, just doubling up the number of rows on a bed halves the amount of space that you're devoting to pathways. And so the more space you have in production, the better production you're going to have. And I know this talk isn't about greens crops, but here's the same principle applied to greens crops. In fact, this is a unheated hoop house certified organic greens production in France that I was lucky enough to visit. And I do like this slide though, because this place, they were a wholesaler, so they would plant a whole half of a greenhouse at a time. And I've never seen anybody in this country doing this, but I'm sure somebody is. They would just roll out. I'm not sure if this is plastic or biodegradable, but they would just roll out, they would just cover the whole greenhouse, plant the whole thing. And so, of course, you can't give much individualized attention to these plants because you only have the one aisle there. But all they would do is just grow them to mature, just start harvesting from one end and just go straight down the tunnel. And so they were wholesalers, so they would clear out that house pretty quickly. But I'm just saying these principles can be creatively applied to all different kinds of crops. So one of the other things that I mentioned as part of the Dutch system is greenhouse pruning and trellising techniques. So pruning can support the high density by increasing the airflow and reducing the disease pressure. And trellising basically helps you take advantage of all that vertical space, right? If you just grow the plants bush style or grow them, let them flop, they're gonna really interfere with each other much more than if you trellis them up. And so, in fact, one of the reasons that I show this picture is I don't actually like what this guy is doing in this picture. This guy has taken off way too many leaves there at the bottom of the plants. In fact, what this guy is doing, he's trying to save on labor by taking a lot of leaves off. He's doing like 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks worth of deleafing in one shot through the greenhouse. Because what in the book, what I recommend you do for tomatoes and for eggplant is to remove the leaves from the bottom of the plant up to the first the bottom developing cluster. So typically what I do is that once my tomatoes or eggplant have set fruit and the lowest fruit are starting to get some size to them, I'll go in there and cut off the bottom leaves so that there are no leaves under the lowest fruit cluster. And this does a couple things. One thing that it does is opening up the airflow. The other thing is that when the tomatoes are surrounded by leaves, they're in a little microclimate. They are cooler and more moist than the surrounding air. And tomatoes will actually ripen faster the warmer that they are. And so if you take the leaves off and let the tomatoes warm up, they will also ripen a little bit faster, and you'll have a lot less rot because the environment down at the base of the plant will be drier. So this is really a slide as much what not to do, but I just thought it's an interesting picture to look at. The guideline that I have in the book is to take off 3 or 4 leaves at a time, and there's a reason I say 3 or 4 leaves, because if you've looked. If you spend a lot of time looking at an indeterminate tomato plant, indeterminate tomato plants have 3 leaves between each fruiting cluster. Almost always is the case. It's just the way the plant grows. And so if what you do is you go in there and every time you pick out a cluster of fruit, the next time you go in there pruning, if you just take the leaves off underneath the next developing cluster, that'll be 3 leaves, and that's also a fairly moderate rate where you're taking leaves off. And it doesn't shock the plant, because of course you are taking off plant parts. If you take off too much of the plant at a time, it can be shocking to the plant. And that it doesn't. If you take them off slowly like that, it doesn't really set the plant back, because those bottom leaves, particularly in a greenhouse where you do have tight spacing, they're not getting a whole lot of sunlight. They're not contributing very much to photosynthesis, and oftentimes that's where the disease starts. So you're kind of putting yourself ahead of the game when you take those leaves off, because if they have disease starting to form, then you take them off and get them out of the greenhouse, and you're taking out some of the pathogens that you might not even be able to see, but could be there ready to spread a disease. Okay, so the use of climate and in particular temperature. So this slide I'm going to talk about temperature. There's some more advanced uses of temperature that we'll talk about in the later presentation. But right here, I just want to talk about using heating just for temperature. So every crop that I talk about in the book, in fact, the top part is a screenshot. This is a screenshot from the book. Every crop has a page like this, where it talks about the average temperature that you want to grow the plant at, minimum and maximums that you don't want to exceed, and then how to actually achieve, what you want your temperature spread to actually look like. Now, understanding of the temperature that your plants want to be at is just as useful for hoop house growers as it is for greenhouse growers. It's just useful in a different way. So in hoop houses, you want to use temperature as more of a scheduling tool for planting dates. In greenhouses, of course, you have extra, you have a lot more control, and it gives you kind of a roadmap of saying how much you need to heat the crops to get them to grow properly, regardless of what the temperature is outside. And in a lot of cases, it's actually the temperatures that you need are actually less than what a lot of people think. I do have detailed temperature recommendations for each crop in the book. If a lot of smaller growers are mixed growers, they may be growing cucumbers in with tomatoes and eggplant. You could do worse if you just wanted to set, let's say, your daytime thermostat for 75 degrees, and nighttime thermostat for 65 degrees, because that gives you an average temperature of about 70 degrees. and then it gives you a 10-degree spread, because that's one thing for fruiting crops. It's important that they have a difference between the day and nighttime temperature, and so for a lot of people that can be useful, because I've met a lot of growers who are heating more than that, who are making daytime temperatures higher than 75, thinking like, oh, these are tomatoes. They love a lot of heat. I need to get them really hot. You know, they can take a lot more heat than they actually really like. In fact, the hotter that tomatoes are grown, they tend to put more of the growth into leaves the higher the temperature it gets. And so it's not such, if you just want to have a ballpark idea of what to set your day-nighttime thermostats for, it gets much more detailed in the book, but 70 in the day, 65 at night is a good ballpark to be in. And of course, once you get into nicer weather, the only time you can keep the temperature below 75 is in the early spring and the fall, because of course once you get sunny days and nice weather, the temperature is going to go over 75 degrees in the daytime, whether you want it to or not. And for hoop house growers, it's equally important to understand what temperature your crop wants to grow at. Let me give you an example from my own growing. I used to really push the season in my hoop houses. I used to grow transplants and get them ready to be ready to go in the ground the first week that we had temperatures in the 40s. Okay, you know, what I was thinking was, there's a whole lot of field growers around me. I need to get my tomatoes as early as possible to make the most of those early season tomatoes, because those are the best sales for us. You know, the early season tomatoes. And so what I would do is I would look at the weather forecast. The first week where temperatures are in the 40s, I would go out there and plant my tomatoes, and of course they would revise the forecast back into the 30s the next week. And so I would spend the whole next week biting my nails, worrying that my hoop house tomatoes are going to get killed. And the thing that I realized from my own experience, and also talking to growers who had heat, which I didn't really have the luxury of at the time, was that my tomatoes don't want to be anywhere near 40 degrees. 30 degrees definitely not, but they don't even want to be in the 40s. So when I was taking my tomatoes and transplanting them out in the hoop house, when nights were in the 40s, they were just struggling. They got so cold, the plant shut down at night. It's like us if we're really too hot or really too cold. You're not going to be very productive. You're not going to be very happy when you're way outside of your comfort range. So I realized, I was like, oh, I'm getting these out as early as possible, and I thought this was a great thing, and I realized it's not, because I would put my tomatoes out into this environment that was really not ideal for them, and they would just struggle. And for one thing, they didn't put on much growth, because they would just stop cold every night, and it'd take them a long time to start growing again. And there are a lot of pathogens that enjoy cool, humid conditions, like are in my hoop house in the early spring. And so there's those certain pathogens are happy, and they're growing along, and my tomatoes are stopped. And that's what you don't want that situation where the pathogens are making progress and your plants aren't. So that's why I say that understanding of temperature is just as important for hoop house growers as it is as greenhouse growers. The other thing that I was having tons of cat facing and in my tomatoes, and particularly heirlooms, because they're prone to that anyway. But what I realized is that when tomato plants are exposed to temperatures below 55 degrees, even if you can't see any flower buds, there may be the first flower buds on your tomato plants are formed something like when they're 14 days old. Okay, so way before you see a flower cluster, they're the cells. The young cells that are going to grow into flowers are there on that plant, on those little seedlings. So being exposed to temperatures below 55 degrees tends to result in deformities. It makes the flower essentially kind of stick together as it's forming, and then when it fills out into a fruit, that's why you get the cat facing and the zippering and all the weird stuff that heirlooms are especially prone to, but all tomatoes, it's worse in all tomatoes when they're exposed to those lower than 55 degree temperatures. So in fact, I mean, that's a pattern that I see a lot when I talk to Hoophouse growers, and they're like, I get this horrible cat facing in my first couple flushes of fruit, and then it just kind of evens out. Well, that's why, because that's extremely common pattern, is when you have your tomatoes planted out into a hoophouse, it's too cold. The first couple sets of fruit are a little messed up, and they may still be saleable. You know, they're just going to be extra ugly. In some cases, not. But that's why that's a pretty characteristic pattern of having messed up fruit at the beginning that just kind of evens out, and that's why, because it's temperature related. So another thing that definitely not all of the big commercial growers are doing, but I'd say a majority now, is grafting. And the reason that I took this picture of a grafted fruit tree one of the times I was out in California visiting farms, just because I was in an orchard. And I like this picture because you can see down at the bottom of the plant the graft union. I'm not even sure what kind of tree that is, but you can see how the root stock is larger and darker, and the fruiting variety is smaller. And I like this picture just because you know, if you've ever pretty much all the apples that you've eaten, probably except for apples that you've picked off of wild trees, all the apples that you've ever eaten have probably been grafted. Most of the grapes, you know, it's what it is it's a technique that takes the plant's own ability to heal itself and just applies it to healing to another plant. And so it's an ancient technique, thousands of years old. And what it is that it hadn't been applied to herbaceous plants like our vegetable plants until the early 1900s. They realized they could do the same thing and get many of the same benefits from grafting fruit trees to for vegetable plants. So grafting is a big deal for me because that's one of the things I did a lot of when I was at Johnny's. I did all the grafting for the rootstock trials at Johnny's, and I think it's I ran a lot of trials, all different. I tried to compare things every different way that I possibly could. I tried to compare grafted tomatoes to the same fruiting variety with one stem, the same fruiting variety with two stems. I tried to make all the different comparisons to see how you could improve yield. And in all the trials that I ran, grafting came out ahead, and pretty significantly. I would say that in most of the grafted trials that I did, we got 30 to 50% more yield off of the grafted plants than the ungrafted plants. And I think it's a particularly good technique for organic growers because it is a way to get around if you have diseases in your soil. The rootstock variety, if you've ever looked at the rootstock varieties, there is a very, they have a huge range of soil-borne diseases typically that they are resistant to. And so for one thing, if you have soil-borne disease, grafting can help you overcome that. And that's a way that I've seen a lot of growers be able to go back to growing heirloom varieties and things like that because as you probably know, most of the heirloom varieties don't have any stated or implied for that matter, disease resistances. They're susceptible to just about everything that's out there. And so it's a way, I mean, that's what I would do. I graft all my heirloom tomatoes to a disease-resistant rootstock. And that way I would avoid whatever diseases are in the soil. Although I don't have any diseases in my soil yet that I know of. So the point that I'd like to make about that is, for one thing, the way to find out that you have a disease in your soil is a really bad way. You know, it's by watching your plants die. So I see grafting as a fairly cheap form of insurance, and so it means that because you know soil growing, which I think is important for organic agriculture. You know, I think it's important that organic agriculture be in the soil, and so as soil growers, it's just a fact of life. The longer that you're growing, the higher the chance you're going to get some kind of disease in your soil. And so, you know, rotation can help with that. Grafting can also help with that. You know, it's just a fact of life. We'd love to have great crop rotations. I see a lot of farms who have the tomato rotation because tomatoes are just such an important cash crop. You know, tomatoes are maybe the most important cash crop on most of the vegetable farms that I see. So in an ideal world, we would have either have other crops that were equally important, or we would just have more protected space, and so we would have nice 4 to 5 year rotations like we do in the field. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have to grow tomatoes after tomatoes after tomatoes, and that's going to tend to build up the disease pressure in your soil, and grafting is one way to get around it. But like I said, I don't have the disease pressure, but I would, even if I knew for some reason I was never going to get diseases, I would still graft, because the other thing that grafting does is that the rootstocks have a much larger, much more vigorous root system that's a more aggressive forager for nutrients in the soil. So it basically just makes a bigger root system that's more aggressive about going out there and getting the fertility. In fact, one thing that growers can sometimes do is ease off on fertilizer. They can fertilize less frequently with grafted plants, because the rootstock is so much bigger and so much more aggressive about going out there and getting the nutrients that they can scale back on fertilizer in many instances. So I'll talk about grafting a little more in the afternoon, the talk this afternoon. And I go on about it quite a bit in the book, just because I feel like I probably got, while I was at Johnny's, I probably got as many questions about grafting as everything else that I talked about. Part of it is because it was an up-and-coming technique when I was there. Another part of it is because it's complicated. So I spend quite a while in the book talking about grafting, because I just got the same questions over and over, and that was really one of the motivations of writing the book too. Not just about grafting, but I felt like one of the things that I was supposed to do while I was at Johnny's was troubleshoot growers' questions for the crops that I handled, right? So tomatoes and all the greenhouse crops and things. You know, if growers called in and said, "Oh, what am I supposed to be doing with this?" they would send them to me. And I felt like I heard the same questions over and over so many times. I thought, if everybody has this question, this is clearly something where the information is either not out there or is not disseminated very well. And it goes back to a saying we have that we say about our farmers markets, and we certainly didn't coin this saying. I don't know who did, but the idea is that if you keep getting the same question over and over at the farmers market, make a sign. You know, if everybody's asking you how much the carrots are, oh, I guess we didn't put a sign on the carrots. We probably should do that, and we can stop answering that question. I took the same perspective with this book. You know, if I keep getting the same questions over and over, I have a pretty good idea what people's questions are. I should just write this down. In fact, I had that thought in my head. I was like, because I was trying to learn as much about Dutch growing as possible, and I was trying to answer my own questions on my farm, and I was trying to answer other growers' questions, and I'd learned this stuff, and I think, somebody should write this stuff down. So finally, after having that thought a few times, I did. This is a batch of grafted tomato plants that I did on my own farm that are about to get transplanted out. So I think the special importance of grafted plants for protected culture is that the increased vigor and disease resistance will keep the plants strong for the full length of your season, right? Because your season is longer, you need the plants to be, you want to be picking tomatoes on the last day of your season, ideally as fast as you're picking them on the first day of the season. And I've been in so many greenhouses, even in our unheated hoop houses even, so still a pretty short season, like in central Maine where I travel around a lot. I've been in so many hoop houses where the tomato plants are just petering out. You know, the top stems have just gotten real thin. They're not really setting any more fruit. And so that's, to my mind, you've lost some of the potential of what you could have harvested there by your plants not making the full length of the season. One thing that will help your fruiting crops a lot is fertigation or side dressing and pulse irrigation. So one of the ideas is that if you had to take, like, let's take this. This is a shot from my own hoop house. Okay, so here's a young crop of tomatoes. If you first of all, I would recommend you get there's a greenhouse soil test. It's called the saturated media extract test. A lot of soil labs, like I know the University of Maine does it, University of Massachusetts does it, a lot of the private labs do it. They may just call it the greenhouse soil test because they factor in that you have a longer season and you're going to need more fertility to grow an adequate crop of whatever you're growing in a extended season. So
I'd recommend that you take a soil test. And if you took the recommendations from that soil test, typically they'll tell you what's there, and they'll say for a crop of tomatoes or whatever, you need this much of everything. If you put everything that this crop of tomatoes needs on day one, there would be way too much nitrogen. There would be way too much of everything, but the things of particular concern would be there would be too much nitrogen. The plants would grow huge and leafy at the expense of fruiting growth. And also, if you put on as much potassium as this crop needed for the whole time it was there, the potassium would bind up other elements. I'm a big fan of either fertigation. So if you're not familiar with fertigation, it's using like adding fertilizer to your water so that the fertilizer just gets dripped right on the crop. So I'm a big fan of fertigation or side dressing, where it doesn't matter how you get your plants fed. It really helps to let's say put half of your fertilizer or half or a third on pre-plant, and then get the rest of the fertilizer to the crops and add it in monthly batches depending on how long your season is, or bi-weekly or whatever. It's one of these things. It doesn't matter. It's not like you have to do it every month. You have to do it every 2 weeks. If you can split up those applications of fertilizer, you're really going to be doing yourselves a favor. There's no one right way to do it. If you're just splitting up your fertilizer applications at all, you'll be doing yourself a big favor. And so I find fertigation easier because it goes through the lines and it gets delivered right to the roots, and it's available. The problem that I've had with side dressing is because since you're in a hoop house or a greenhouse, it's a very humid environment and it's hot. So when I've sprinkled side dressing at the sides of my tomatoes, I've actually had the fertilizer mold, form mold, because it just sat on the soil and it was very humid. And so it basically rotted. And I know some growers who get around this by trying to scratch it in, for example. If you are side dressing, you are probably going to have to take an extra step or two to get the fertilizer incorporated into the soil. So you could either scratch it in. I know some growers who would lay landscape fabric, up to the edge of the plants, and they would maybe pull the landscape fabric back, sprinkle it at the base of the plants, and put the landscape fabric back over. And the one thing that would do is it would keep the moisture. It would get the fertilizer wetter, and because it would trap all that moisture between the soil and the landscape fabric, and that may help get that fertilizer active down there in the soil as well. But some kind of supplemental fertility is going to be a huge help. One thing I was doing, actually I didn't even know it was called pulse irrigation, but it's a nice name for it, was just breaking up irrigations. For example, if I knew that I wanted to put an hour of water on a particular hoop house in a day, I would just buy a cheap irrigation timer, $30-40, goes right on the hose bib, and I would break up an hour's worth of watering into four 15-minute waterings. And a really good rule of thumb about that for hoop houses is not to start watering until at least 2 hours after sunrise and stop within 2 hours of sunset, because you really don't want to be putting the water on the plants when the plants aren't active, because the water tends to just sit there around the roots, and that can increase foliar problems. And one of the big reasons to do pulse irrigation is it helps with splitting in tomatoes. Okay, so you're probably familiar with this if you've ever grown sun gold or maybe those thin-skinned heirlooms, right? Out in the field, rains a lot. Next day you go out to pick, they're all split. Even if you pick them hard the day before, varieties that are just notoriously prone to splitting, it may not matter how hard you picked them. They may still split. And so with pulse irrigation, right, so multiple smaller waterings instead of one big watering, I can grow sun gold, I can grow any thin-skinned heirloom, anything, with no splitting, because the plant never has that big intake of water that contributes to the fruit swelling up and splitting. White ground cover makes a big difference with actually, this is good for all crops, including the leafies, but especially the vining fruiting crops. White ground cover is important for two reasons. Doesn't matter if it's a big greenhouse like this one, or the next picture, I have a picture of it in my own smaller hoop house. So two things the white ground cover does. Something like 80% of the light that hits the ground is bounced back up into the canopy of the plants when you have white ground cover, and the plants can still use it even though it's hitting them from the underside of the leaves. So you're actually recouping some of the sunlight that would otherwise be wasted that's coming into your structure. And so this is my hoop house. You can see this is actually maybe just a later photo of the picture I showed you a minute ago of the fertigation and pulse irrigating, because after we get everything set, we put down white plastic. And the other thing is that it helps keep the structure cooler in the summer. Now I think of black plastic as really a field technique, right? Because especially here in the Northeast, we need every last shred of heat, and particularly to warm up the root system for our field tomatoes. In protected culture, you want your hoop house there is really the thing that is you're using to modify the climate. In fact, I have, as soon as it gets sunny in the springtime, I have problems with my hoop houses, even though we're in cold old Maine, getting too hot. And so I think that using the flip side of using the plastic is that it helps moderate the temperature, because as soon as it gets sunny, I'm worried about it getting too hot, particularly in regards to killing the blossoms on the tomatoes, causing blossom drop and things like that. So white fabric. Although I will point out, it's important to use something that's opaque. In fact, in this picture, this is white on black plastic, because if you just put down thin white plastic that lets light through, or like they sell white landscape fabric that lets the light through, the weed seeds will still germinate if light is getting through there. And so of course you fertilized everything, you're watering it, and weed seeds will germinate, and heat tolerant weeds will just grow and be very happy under there and be a jungle and be a real pain, because of course it's under plastic, so it's hard for you to get rid of. So I really like some kind of a white ground covering, an opaque white ground covering. Insect netting. So we used to have a terrible problem with cucumber beetles on our cukes, because we are organic, don't have much that's very effective against them. Plus, we'd rather play defense than go on offense anyway. So what would happen is that we would plant our cucumber plants out in the springtime. Cucumber beetles emerge from the soil early in the season, typically before there's very much cucurbit crops planted in the field. And so basically our hoop house cukes would be the only thing on the menu for them. We had terrible problems with cucumber beetles on our cukes until we netted the house off. This is the Protect Net from Dubois Agri-Innovations. I know it's available from them, available from some other retailers. We had really good luck reducing the number of cucumber beetles. They still get in, but usually what it does for us is it keeps them down to a dull roar. I don't know where they get in. We netted off everything, as you saw from that earlier picture. We netted up our end wall vents and everything. And they're small, they still get in somewhere, but it's the difference between our plants being all chewed up and getting bacterial wilt and having a few cucumber beetles in there that are manageable. This one isn't particularly exciting, but it's really important, and this is something that the big Dutch growers do. Keep records of yield, amount sold, price, weather. Keep records of anything that's significant to your growing, because, for example, I wouldn't be able to tell you that we went from 1 ton to 2 tons of tomatoes if we weren't keeping records. There are a lot of weather tracking programs that will keep track of the conditions inside your hoop house. You don't even have to write it down. A lot of them will write it to a disk or a computer or something like that. So because then that's important, because you might be wondering why your production's so low, and then you look back at your temperature records and see, oh, in the past at this time of the year it's been 75 degrees out and it's been 95 for a week. And my plants are really way too hot and unhappy. And at least it can help you figure out what to attribute, particularly production problems, to have some kind of a track record. And just all the computerization of this makes it that much easier to keep up on that. So we're almost to the end here. One of the other things is to try using varieties bred specifically for protected culture. The reason I put this picture of a cuc up here is because cucumbers have some adaptations in particular that are really helpful in protected culture, being gynoecious, for example. So all the flowers are female. So you can see in this picture, there's a cuc at the base of every single flower. So this is a gynoecious cucumber variety because cucurbits in general have a lot of male flowers. Like most of your field varieties have male and female flowers, and a lot of them are, you don't get any cucs off the male flowers, of course, so particularly if you're pruning the cucs a lot like you would in most protected culture systems, you're going to get a much higher yield because whatever flowers are left on the plant, you have the potential to get a cucumber off of each of them. And there's another thing for cucs of being parthenocarpic, which parthenocarpic means that they'll set fruit even if they're not pollinated, because cucurbits typically, they're not excited about making food for you to eat. They're trying to pass on their genes. Most cucurbits will not put the energy into developing a fruit unless that fruit is pollinated. So there's this trait that they just found in wild some cucumber plants where they will make cucs whether they're pollinated or not. That's important because if you have your hoop house netted off like I do, or the bigger your hoop house gets, if you don't have bees in there or something, there may not be anything to pollinate the cucs. So those two things contribute hugely to yield. And this is something where if you're using a field variety in a greenhouse, if you use a parthenocarpic gynoecious variety, you're going to get higher yield. Just for kicks, sometimes we would throw some field varieties in the trials when we were doing them at Johnny's, and it was stark. It was night and day, the yield that you would get off a field variety grown in a greenhouse versus a greenhouse variety. So don't take it from me entirely. If you're skeptical about protected varieties, do a small planting. I'm not saying switch everything over, and like I said, I still grow a lot of heirlooms, but it's worth test running, and that would be the ideal way to do it. That's what I would always tell people is don't switch. If you have a tried and true variety, don't switch everything based on another variety sounding better. Do a test planting 1 year, see how it works for you, track the yield and longevity, and then if that variety does work out, then you'll have a track record and you can switch. So I just want to close. Another picture of I guess I like to take pictures of my kids out in my hoop house. I just want to say, small is beautiful. Go Dutch. Be efficient. Grow high value crops and make the most of your protected space, and do a lot with a little. So I'm gonna stop there and open it up for questions.